Picture yourself in a small barracks module drifting in low orbit. The only sounds are soft air systems, muted engines, and the faint metallic settling of a ship. Nothing is happening. Nothing is expected of you. Tonight's military sci-fi tale unfolds with that same slow, steady rhythm, easy to follow, easy to fall asleep to. Everything feels distant now, like a base settling into its night cycle. The story ahead drifts in at that same slow rhythm. Let's step into it. They told me the transcripts would be reviewed by 3 boards, one for the regiment, one for the coalition, and one for the concession courts. 3 different sets of people looking for 3 different flavors of blame. The room they put me in for this is smaller than a mining locker. One wall is all med scaffolding and diagnostic feeds, the other is bare gray paneling. Gravity is a 10th light, just enough that my stumps ache where the prosthetic sockets bite. I can hear the carrier's reactor humming through the hull, a soft, steady vibration like a distant drill head working a seam. They planted the recorder on the stand beside the bed and left me alone with it. So this is what they get. The sequence, as clean as I can make it. No speeches, no comfort, just the way Kepri 9 broke under our hands. I was a breacher in 3rd Expeditionary, attached to the stabilization force sent to restore lawful access to the Kepri concessions. On paper, we secured infrastructure. In practice, we broke things other people cared about. Before that, I ran charges deep underground for a miners' co-op in the Twilight Band, south of the equator. Same sand, same rock, less armor. When the strike went bad, when the concession brought in a contract brigade and armored shuttles, the co-op made a deal. Names went on lists. Certain men and women got shipped off-world as technical reinforcements and came back in gray exosuits with Legion patches. That's how I traded a company number for a regiment number. The rock dust never really left my lungs. The op that started it, the one the lawyers circle like carrion, was supposed to be simple, a logistics cut. We knew the contract troops controlling the elevator were running their heavy loads along a maglev spur that skirted a half-buried ridgeline. No civilian housing, no surface pit, no marked infrastructure besides the line itself. On the satellite plots, it was a clean, sterile target. Command gave us a section of armor, a handful of militia trucks, and my engineering cell. Drop from the carrier to a staging pad, one of those flat, burned squares you can stamp into any desert and then roll out under dusk. That's how Kepri always looked if you lived in the band, a bruised horizon in every direction, sky-stained orange where the Terminator line hung, stars only if you looked high enough away from the elevator's glow. The sand there wasn't soft. It was metallic dust that tried to crawl into every seal and joint, fine as flour and abrasive as ground glass. We rode in tracked carriers with the shutters down, listening to sand hammer the hull. The exosuits stayed sealed. You didn't pop your lid out there unless you wanted the dust in your lungs. I sat strapped into a folding web seat, harness digging across my ribs, helmet resting against composite, watching my HUD flicker with convoy telemetry. 8 vehicles in the column. 2 tanks up front, low and flat, their coil guns slaved to a drone net. 4 tracked transports. A logistics wagon carrying the fission sled, its containment lights pulsing a calm, steady blue. And the last vehicle, our comms hub, running a tight-beamed link back to the staging pad. At the time, the sled was just another glow on the status board, a backup power source we might need if the contract troops decided to play rough. I didn't think of it as anything more. My suit's internal clock ticked off the hours. Outside, the land rolled by as featureless wireframe on the nav, broken only by 10-meter contour lines. I checked my charges again on the HUD, running through the inventory. Shape charges, cutting strips, clamshell snares for rails, all green, all synced. Nervous energy came out as mechanical ritual. Verify, tag, verify again. I boosted a microdose of stimulant into my bloodstream and felt the fuzziness around my mining injury recede. The left hip liked to remind me of that cave-in, especially when the air pressure shifted, like it could feel the weather through ceramic and steel. The maglev spur rose out of the desert as a thin line on the horizon, climbing up out of the sand onto pylons. The contract architects had used standard kit, composite pillars, tension struts, no ornament. Someone had modeled it beautiful once on a screen. Out here, it was just gray skeleton against darker gray sky. We parked the carriers in a shallow depression that the sat maps called cover and the wind called completely exposed. Drones went up in pairs, rotors whispering, and I got my first live look at the target through their feeds. 4 pillars in our zone. We only needed to break one to make the line unusable. Command had flagged Pylon 17 as optimal, nearest maintenance spur, farthest from any auxiliary power taps. I took myself forward in exosuits, the suit's servos whining quietly with each step. Sand hissed against my boots. Above, the maglev rail hummed faintly with standby current. No cargo at the moment. That's why they picked the window. Old habits from the pits save time. You see supports, you see where the load transfers. Pylon 17 had a hollow service core, maintenance rungs molded into one face. I climbed with the charges hanging off my harness, counting breaths. I laid the cutting strips at the base, angled them to chew out the central load baths. Set the delays, ran the lines back to the control slab on my wrist. Standard work. Thoughtless almost. I'd done more elegant cuts beneath a kilometer of rock with worse equipment. When I keyed my suit to call it in, my voice came out flat even to my own ears. Engineering set, timers loaded. We fell back to the depression. The armor hunkered down, coil guns tracking sky and horizon. The militia trucks idled, fans whining, drivers watching the rail like it might leap off its mounts. Command gave the order. 4 shaped charges went off in perfect sequence. Through the drone feeds, I watched Pylon 17 shear just above its foundation, the upper section folding in slow, graceful motion. The rail twisted, snapped, and dropped in a cloud of dust. It was almost pretty. The first sign that it wasn't pretty at all was the tremor under my boots, not the familiar thump of ground shock from controlled demolition. A deeper shudder, like the planet itself had rolled in its sleep. My HUD glitched, recovered, then overflowed with alerts as sensor feeds spiked. Under the ground, the seismics we'd lazily tied into the suit net went from a mild green wiggle to an angry red wall. The drones looking down at the ruined pylon caught the moment it changed. Beneath the broken foundation, the sand sagged and flowed away, revealing something that wasn't dirt or rock. Hexagons at first, dull and slick, forming a plate where there should have been nothing. Light traced along the seams, faint blue-white lines sketching a pattern that made no human sense. The maglev debris slid down, clanging, and then it was like someone drew a circle under Pylon 17 and decided everything inside that circle didn't belong. Sand, wreckage, and air erupted straight up in a column of light and molten glass. The blast knocked the closest drone out of the sky in a smear of static. The concussion hit us a breath later, a blunt fist through the armor. I saw militia trucks rock on their suspensions, men and women staggering, suit gyros fighting to stay upright. At the edges of the blast site, where the eruption met desert, the sand changed. Through the second drone still alive for the moment, I watched ripples spread, a growing, glowing ring running out across the smooth dunes like a shockwave. Where it passed, the surface went from matte to glossy, glass. The planet was glazing itself over. Someone in the comms wagon screamed over the net and then cut off. I didn't hear the words. I saw the waveform spike across my HUD as all the channels saturated. I remember thinking, very calmly, that wasn't in the briefing. The first glassfall came minutes later. It started as a high, thin whine on the suit audio, so faint I thought it was just feedback. The skies above us had turned a flat, dirty orange, the dust higher up lit from beneath by that hexagonal glow. Then the whine deepened, turned into a hiss, and the air itself seemed to scratch. My suit's external temps climbed. Tiny impacts registered on the armor, more and more, like the world's worst sandblaster. The abrasion alarms triggered where the coating wore thin. The drones saw it first, a curtain of shimmering particles descending out of that orange haze. Sand, lifted by the eruption, and then passed through whatever field those plates were generating. Every grain a sliver. You can't hide from the air. Glassfall shredded the first carrier's external optics, stripping housings down to bare metal. Militia caught outside in soft armor went down in seconds, flayed wherever the plates didn't overlap. I watched men I knew from the pits jerk and twist as the storm took them, their suits staining dark around every seam. We slammed carrier hatches, sealed what we could, turned our armored hulls toward the worst of it. Even so, I heard the hiss of needles against my own visor, saw the faint scoring marks they left behind. The suit chimed warnings about optical integrity. We sat inside that storm for 10 minutes, maybe 20, time bent. The only constants were the scream of particles and the constant crawling awareness that if any seal failed, if any gasket gave, the air would slice us apart. Then it passed. When we opened up again, Kepri's twilight band was gone. In its place was a landscape of fused, cooling glass, rippled and bubbled, still smoking in places. The maglev line we'd come to break was a half-submerged fracture in a much larger wound. The dead didn't look like bodies anymore. They looked like shadows cast inside the glass. Limbs caught mid-motion, fingers outstretched, faces blurred. A thumb here, a jaw there. We lost count of casualties at 50, then at 100. After that, they were just icons going gray on the sub roster. The lattice didn't stop with one ring. As we watched, more concentric patterns lit up under the surface in all directions, marching outward. Wherever the patterns brightened, the storms followed. Above, the contract gunship that had been circling the elevator tried to investigate. Its heat signature flared as it powered up thrusters, and the world answered. No visible beam, just a sudden line of incandescent air, a needle of heat from ground to sky, and the gunship came apart. Debris fell in long burning trails, some pieces already glowing as they descended toward the next activated ring. That was the moment everyone realized the war we thought we were fighting was over. We'd woken something else, and it didn't care whose flag was painted on the hulls. Our comms winked in and out as the EM environment went insane. The carrier back at the staging pad spat partial orders, broken by static. Fall back, regroup, evaluate. Then, after a gap long enough for any number of things to die, a new directive pushed through the noise. Priority 1. Understand and, if possible, disable the lattice before it renders evacuation impossible. They attached coordinates. A basin farther south, in a region where earlier surveys had recorded an unexplained dip in background emissions. Some analyst of orbit had decided that meant control node. We were the closest unit with intact armor and engineering capability. Congratulations, Sergeant Vale. Your mess, your mop. We refueled from the logistics wagon, patched what armor we could, and started moving. Driving over newly fused glass is like driving over frozen ocean. It looks solid until it isn't. The carrier's tracks bit and skittered, chewing grooves into the cooling surface. In places, the glass was thin enough to crack under the weight, sending fractures racing out in spiderwebs that sounded like distant thunder. We navigated by dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse of the elevator on the distant horizon, a straight line stabbing into the dark. GPS was noise now, satellites blinded or gone. Along the way, we picked up survivors, contract troopers whose gunships had come down hard but survivable, miners who'd been out in insulated crawlers and somehow dodged the first wave, medics dragging field kits through glittering drifts of shards. By the time we pointed our noses toward the basin, the distinctions between uniform colors had blurred. Anyone alive and functional rode with us or limped behind. I remember passing what had been a refueling depot, a cluster of tanks and pumps I'd seen a dozen times before on convoy duty, and seeing it as a single, warped sculpture. Metal, sand, and bone fused into an indistinct mass. You couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The lattice pulsed under us in dim cycles. Light ran along hidden channels beneath the glass, like a heartbeat we were irritating by our presence. Every time the glow brightened, everyone flinched, waiting for the next storm. Some came. Not as bad as the first, but enough to keep us honest. We learned the signs, a metallic taste in the air, a faint rise in static on the suit hairline sensors, then the first hiss. When the storms caught us in the open, we turned the carriers into circles, hulls outward, and huddled in their lee. Needles rattled against the armor, found seams, slipped in wherever a maintenance plate had gone missing. People died inside vehicles they thought were safe, bleeding out into their suits, their voices low and shocked as they reported failures that we couldn't fix under fire. Our numbers thinned. At some point during that crawl, the suit net finally synced long enough with orbit to push us a reality we'd mostly suspected. The ships above Kepri were in trouble. The same invisible spears that had taken down the gunship were stabbing at anyone who tried to light a fusion torch. Drives were being quenched mid-burn. Reactors were being forced into safe shutdown. Orbits decay even slower than lives, but they do decay. The message came through in clear, clipped bursts. We have hours, not days. After that, anyone not already off-planet becomes part of the glass. It wasn't phrased that way, but that's what it meant. Command framed the new mission as an opportunity. Disable or confuse the lattice, and we might keep the window open long enough to evacuate not just the forces, but some portion of the civilians. Maybe even salvage the elevator. In the carrier, listening to that, I watched the roster scroll past on my HUD, all the names in gray, and thought, there is no we anymore. There are a dozen battered machines and a couple dozen people inside them, being asked to kick a god in the throat. We reached the basin at what my suit said was local midnight, though the sky looked no different than it always did, strip of dirty orange along the horizon, darkness up high. The basin itself was a depression roughly 3 kilometers across, sunk into the glassy plain. Its walls were smooth, sloping, lined with hexagonal plates like the ones we'd first revealed, but more regular, more deliberate. At the center of the basin, where all the subtle flows of light converged, was a hollow, a throat. My sensors couldn't get a depth reading. Beams went down and never bounced back. Our drones didn't want to go near it. The few we coaxed over the lip glitched, spun, and fell, their feeds cutting out in a stutter of static. The EM field in the basin was a storm of its own. It fuzzed suit diagnostics, scrambled remote triggers. The detonators on my charges flickered in and out of status, never stable more than a few seconds at a time. We parked the carriers at the rim and dismounted, boots on glass, the material faintly warm underfoot. The fission sled rolled down the ramp behind us, its containment lights still pulsing calm blue. Someone had decided, between the first directive and this moment, that if we couldn't understand the lattice in time, we could at least punch it, overload a compact pile in its throat, and hope the shock forced it into some safer mode, or at least blew out enough of its innards to stop the orbital spears. There was no talk of timers and remote fuses. Under these conditions, anything relying on a delicate pulse or a weak signal was a prayer with wires attached. We jury-rigged what we could: hardline detonator, mechanical deadman switch, redundancies that didn't need silicon. It all came back to the same conclusion. Someone had to go down into that throat, drag the sled as far in as possible, arm it physically, and stay near enough to ensure nothing failed at the last instant. We all knew who that someone would be long before anyone said it. A breacher's job doesn't end at setting the charge. It ends when the structure behaves the way it should. We had maybe 20 effectives left by then. The roster was a mess of crossed-out call signs and reattached biomonitors. Some of them had been contract troopers the day before. Out here, under the glow, they were just bodies wrapped in ceramic and hope. I walked the sled down the inner slope, boots crunching on a thin film of brittle glass dust that had settled even here. The walls hummed. Light pulsed along the hex plates faster as I descended, like the lattice recognized the approaching mass of enriched fuel and moving parts. The throat narrowed as it went. We tracked depth on the sled's inertial sensors until those too became lies, jittering between numbers. Gravity wobbled. Once, for a few steps, I felt lighter, then heavier, as if the planet was experimenting with me. At some point, the voices from above faded to a faint murmur I barely heard through the suit. The EM static hardened into a constant pressure behind my eyes. My HUD blurred. I switched half my displays to manual analog readouts, the little mechanical needles calmer than the digital noise. I stopped when the walls around me changed from hexagonal plates to something smoother, continuous, as if I'd reached a deeper layer of whatever this construct had been designed to be. The pulsing light here wasn't blue-white anymore. It had shifted toward ultraviolet, an invisible brightness only hinted at by the way it made edges haloed and uncertain. There, in that suffocating humming gullet, I began the arming sequence. Mechanical safety covers lifted with a clack that felt obscene in the silence. I threw levers, inserted pins, dialed in the countdown with gloved fingers that had to fight tremors and the unsteady gravity. I said it shorter than doctrine recommended, not because I wanted to die, but because I'd walked this world long enough to know that leaving it time to react was worse than leaving myself time to climb. With the last cover sealed, and the last indicator turned from safe to life, I keyed my suit to transmit a single burst, package armed, ignition imminent. I don't know if anyone heard it. Maybe the carrier recorder picked it up. Maybe only this one, here in my room, ever will. Then the world broke. The overload was not a sound or a flash. It was an erasure. For a fraction of a second, long enough for nerves to notice, everything in me stretched and went thin. The lattice's pulsing pattern spiked into something indescribable, then dropped to nothing. The pressure inside my skull released all at once, like a migraine ending in a hammer blow. My suit's systems all died together, leaving me blind and deaf. Gravity lost its mind. I felt myself thrown sideways, then up, then nowhere at all. When I came back to sensation, it was because of pain. Cold at first, a deep, gnawing cold in my lower body that turned, increment by increment, into a hot, buzzing absence. I tried to move my legs and nothing answered. Emergency power brought a sliver of HUD back online. Dim green text ghosted across darkness. "Suit breach," it said calmly, somewhere in the generic area of my lower torso. Integrity compromised. Environment, vacuum, or something near it. I tasted copper. Half my teeth ached. I saw light above me, a thin, jagged line of it where the world had cracked. Through that split, a strip of sky showed, black, clean, spattered with more stars than Kepri's twilight band ever allowed. No elevator, no orange haze. Something had punched a hole in the basin's throat and in the world above it, opening a pocket where I lay wedged in broken, cooled material. The walls around me were no longer smooth plates. They were fractured, jagged layers of once molten glass and composite fused into a coffin. I watched the sky for a long time, measuring my breaths, feeling blood pool and thicken. At some point, a streak of light crossed that strip. Not the straight plummet of a falling ship, but the steady, controlled burn of a drive. Someone, somewhere up there, had found enough freedom from the lattice's grip to light an engine and climb. I don't know how long it took them to dig me out. My suit's internal clock had lost its mind in the overload, looping the same minute over and over. I drifted in and out of consciousness. the world narrowing to the taste of dead air and the creeping chill in my fingers. Rescue, when it came, arrived as vibration, then as the distant thump of tools on stone. An external cutter bit through the cracked material, spraying dust into my dark. Then there were gloved hands, hard grips on my shoulders, the sudden sting of fresh air flooding the suit as someone overrode its seals. Voices came in as muffled shapes, not words. My ears had given up. Faces swam in my failing HUD, tagged with call signs I didn't recognize, attached to uniforms that looked like my regiment's but worn by strangers. They cut me free of the exosuit along with what remained of my lower body, wrapped me in a vacuum shroud that smelled of antiseptic and plastic, and hauled me up through the wound in the basin. I only got one clear look at the basin from above before the medications smothered everything. The hexagonal plates were dark now, their internal light gone. The patterns that had run under the glass across the plane had faded, replaced by spiderweb cracks and cooled flows. Kepri had stopped shining. It was just a broken world again. Now, in the carrier, I get the distilled version from the officers and medtechs who drop by between debates. The overload buckled a critical part of the lattice. The spears into orbit faltered, drives relit. The evacuation window widened from hours to something like half a day. Not enough to save the concessions, or the co-ops, or the little towns strung along the pits, but enough to clear the ships, the regiment, and as many civilians as they could stuff into bulk freighters and troop holds. They call that a win. Kepri is under total abandonment order now. No one drops there except remote probes, and most of those die. The elevator is rubble. The band is a ring of glass that still throws back sunlight so hard you can pick it out from the next system over. The boards will argue about the rest for years. They'll draw diagrams showing how Pylon 17 rested on a previously undetected anomaly. They'll circle my demolition signature and link it to casualty projections. They'll weigh the value of the concessions against the cost in bodies, and they'll write doctrines to make sure the next regiment that hits a buried lattice does something smarter, faster, more controlled. None of that changes what I did when I pressed the detonator the first time, or the second. People ask, when they get bold, if I'm proud. They don't say it like that, not out loud, but it's in the way they hover at the edge of the bed, waiting for a line they can stamp onto a briefing slide. I'm not proud. Pride needs clean edges. What I have is numbers and names and a map in my head of where the glass is thickest. I see the miners I knew, trapped in that first ring. I see the contract pilot whose gunship tried to help and got erased by an invisible lance. I see my own squad, half of them turned gray on the roster before we even saw the basin. And I see the streak of that drive crossing the thin patch of sky over my coffin, and I know that without the second blast, there wouldn't have been any streaks at all. Hero, butcher, scapegoat. They're all just different names for the same set of actions, viewed from different elevations. The recorder's light is still on. The reactor hum is still under everything, steady as Kepri's static winds used to be. My legs itch even though they aren't there. Phantom nerves, phantom ground. They'll take this audio and cut it into exhibits. Someone will listen for tremors in my voice, for signs of remorse or lack of it. They'll build a man out of words and decide how many medals and how many charges fit on his chest. All I can give them is the truth. As I remember it, we woke something in the dark under that world, and then we broke it before it finished waking. The cost is carved into the glass. When the lights dim for ship's night cycle, the ceiling above my bed turns a softer shade of gray. I close my eyes, and it stays there. The basin's throat, the hexagonal walls, the pulse of a machine older than anything we ever built, waiting for a signal it will never get again. Sometimes I think I can feel a pattern still beating under the hum of the carrier's reactor, like an echo from somewhere far below the glass. A structure, wounded but not dead, listening. If it is, it knows my name now, in its own way. That's the part no board can write into doctrine. The end. The tale ends, and the ship settles into low idle. No alarms, no motion, just the soft hum around you. Let it carry you into sleep.